Okay, so I think that's everybody in. Hopefully you can all hear me. We are starting at 4:01, very impressively. So my name is Rory and I'm chairing this very exciting session on innovation in worship. And we've got three lovely speakers who are going to talk to us this morning, well, this afternoon. I've lost all track of time. I've been on Zoom all day. And what I'm going to do is very briefly introduce the three of them and then hand over to them. And they're going to tell us a little bit about the innovative things that they've been doing in their context and in their congregation. And then we were just talking just before, and we feel like what would be really good is for everybody to have a chance to talk to each other and to discuss what innovative worship looks like to them, or what it could look like. And so with the second half of this session, we're going to do some breakout groups and small group discussion and that kind of thing as well. So with that in mind, what I'm going to suggest or politely ask is that we save that discussion, I guess, for that second half and try and refrain, if possible, from using the chat function, which can be a little bit distracting for some people. So feel free to use it if you've got a technical question or something that you want to sort out to do with using Zoom or accessing the session. But if it's a question for the panelists or about innovative worship, then if you could hang on until the second half an hour, and I promise there'll be lots of opportunity to ask questions and to talk then. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is hand over to our speakers, and we've got Torry Glinwell, who's from the Octagon Chapel in Norwich, Jane Blackall from Kensington Unitarians, and then Alexis Granum, who's from New Unity in London. And they're all going to talk to you about innovation in worship in quite different ways and in different contexts, I think. And it feels like this felt like an exciting session when we originally planned to do it in our annual meetings in Birmingham in a hotel. But now, in the context in which we're living and trying to come up with ways to still worship together, we're being forced to be innovative, whether we like it or not, dragged into the 21st century for some of us. This feels like such a relevant session. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've all got to say. So first, I think we're going to go to Jane Blackall. So I will unmute you. And if people want to just see Jane talking and then the other speakers, you can, at the top right of your screen, if you click on speaker view, you'll get a big picture of Jane rather than all the little screens that you might be looking at the moment. So that's an option that I'm going to do now. So over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. So the plan is that I'm going to talk about heart and soul, which is something that you've probably heard quite a bit about in the last few days, because it's all over your programme for this larger event. My plan is to tell you the origin story, why it came to pass in the first place, what it is, and the developments over the last 7 years since we first initiated it, including the developments of the last month when something that's been running in the real world for 7 years very hastily went online. So that's the shape of what I'm going to say. So Heart and Soul is a monthly prayer-centric gathering that happens at Kensington Unitarians Essex Church, and increasingly in other places as well. The prehistory of Heart and Soul is this. I had a need that wasn't getting met for some form of contemplative gathering within Unitarianism. And I find that almost anything I ever do that's any good comes from some nagging dissatisfaction that I want to see addressed. I find it terribly frustrating when people say someone should do something about this. So when I feel that feeling arising in myself, I think, oh, right, it better be me that does something about this. So that was the origin of Heart and Soul. I'd been doing a fair bit of work based on this book, Simply Pray by Eric Walker Wickstrom, a UU minister. I'd run a course on that with a Quaker friend who's the warden in our congregation, probably 10 years ago now, and then maybe even longer, and then did an adapted version of such a course on exploring prayer at summer school in the year after. And I felt there was a bit of a need out there for engaging more seriously with prayer within Unitarianism. And it really seemed to speak to some people. One of the key things about this book is Eric Walker-Wickstrom has really looked into comparative prayer in different traditions and tried to find a way of dealing with the situation we've got in Unitarianism, where you've got a fair bit of theological variation, and how do you find a language and a structure that enables people with quite different outlooks to pray together. So putting that aside, that was lurking in my mind as something that made me think I would love to have a Unitarian prayer group happening regularly, but I hadn't done anything about it. Then separately, at Essex Church, we had an inquiry out of the blue from a chap who was a flight attendant, who was dissatisfied that there was no Unitarian congregation anywhere in the London area at that time doing any worship that wasn't on a Sunday, and he was always working on flights over the weekend, so he couldn't get to anything at all. So we considered, is there anything we could offer? Could we offer an extra midweek worship? But we didn't want to put a great burden on our minister, who was already, leading plenty of services. And then the two ideas came together in my mind. So I thought, can we do an alternative style of spiritual gathering that is centered on prayer, and that the minister doesn't have to run single-handedly? So bringing all those things together, a small bunch of us, about half a dozen, started knocking around ideas of what such a gathering could look like. And in the end, we just put a date in the diary and said, let's give it a go. So we held our first one in very early 2013, I think. And over the first 6 months, we met once a month, first Thursday of the month, and slightly tweaked it every time until we got into a rhythm we were happy with. And more or less, the shape of it has stayed constant since then. The only other thing to mention at this stage about the why and the thinking behind it before we started is that we wanted it to be a balance of a high quality offering, as high quality and safe and spiritually serious as it could be, and we wanted as wide a range of people in the congregation as possible to feel empowered to run it. So there was that tension between professionalism and inclusiveness and empowering everyone to be on board. So that's all the context. The real world face-to-face gatherings are usually gatherings of about 8 to 12 people. That's the optimum, but we're totally open door. We work with who turns up. So sometimes they've been considerably bigger than that and a little bit out of hand. Sometimes they're very small, but where 2 or 3 are gathered and all that. And it's a very, very structured, repetitive format with a small amount of space for customization by whoever's running it. So it will be a mixture of just 1 or 2 readings, usually recorded music, and the heart of heart and soul, as we like to say, is in an hour-long session is a 30 to 40-minute period often of interactive prayer. And one of the key things from this book of Eric Walker-Wickstrom's is that he pulls out 4 strands of prayer that he says are common to all traditions: naming, knowing, listening, and loving, which translates roughly to thanksgiving and gratitude prayers, self-reflection and kind of confession prayers, silent meditation, and prayers of loving kindness and compassion for the world. So the script for every heart and soul session, that 30 to 40-minute section in the middle, is identical every time. You just take it off the shelf and you read the same words, because what matters is what people bring to it, what they share into the space, and the internal reflection they're doing on the basis of those prompts that I read out, or whoever's leading the session reads out. And then each session will also have a theme, and so towards the end of the hour there'll be perhaps 5-10 minutes for, again, contributions into the space to share on the theme. The quality of these gatherings is extremely intimate, and that is a need I wasn't necessarily getting met in other settings. The sharing is often very moving, very profound. It's a great way of strengthening relationships within the congregation. It's something very different to a chat group, a discussion group, or even an engagement group. And interestingly, in these gatherings, we don't often talk about covenants or any of the things that you might do in other small group work. It's one of the benefits of having such a very rigid and repetitive structure is that the structure holds the depth. So I know some people might have resistance to doing something which is so structured and repetitive, but that is where the safety seems to come from. The other essential part of a heart and soul gathering when you're meeting face to face is cake. We've all built in from the very start that the gathering should also include some element of hospitality, and I always try and make the most fancy cake I can possibly offer, not just to lure people in, because I often post pictures of the cake on Facebook beforehand to remind people to come, but just so that people feel really cared for, and that has proved to be a vital part of the evenings, really, that decompression time after a very contemplative, very held hour, to then it drops you into a different level of sharing, even though it is just tea, cake and chat, just tea, cake and chat afterwards. So that's been running, as I say, since 2013, once a month at Kensington. But after the first year or so, I was thinking, we've got something good here. I wonder if other congregations would be interested in picking this up. So we plugged it at Fuse, we plugged it at Summer School, and so in recent years, it's now happening, not monthly in all these locations, but it's happening in Hampstead, Brighton. Brighton really have gone to town with it. Well done, Brighton. Sevenoaks, Golders Green, Hastings. I'm sorry if I've forgotten anyone. But as it seemed to have got a certain amount of momentum of its own, for Fuse this year, just February this year, I decided to set up a website purely about heart and soul. So that's heartandsoulcircles.org.uk, and that is a place to collectively list all the congregations that are running these groups, so that we kind of cross promote, especially in the London area. You know, people could conceivably be going to a different one in a different congregation every week of the month. But also I have now got a password protected section on there for people who potentially want to lead it in new locations, so that we can share the resources, so that we haven't got to reinvent the wheel. If people have already got perfectly good session plans, other people can just pick up and run with those in new locations. So that's a very recent development, but if anyone is interested in having access to that material, do contact me. What else do I need to mention? So yeah, that takes the story to February. Obviously, in the last month, rapid developments have ensued. As soon as we realised that the face-to-face annual meetings weren't going to happen, it was suggested to me that we might do Heart and Soul online as part of this gathering. And so I quickly put a shout out on Facebook and said, does anyone want to give this a try? And within 2 days, we had the first one, and I've been running it 3 times a week ever since. And other people are taking it on, so Mark Hutchinson, Ned Prideaux, Stephanie Bisbee at the moment, and others. I know some people are doing it for local groups as well, but those gatherings at the moment are all happening at least once a week and are open to absolutely anyone. So we're finding Unitarians, Quakers, Anglicans, and people of no particular religion who know any one of us that are leading them are coming in and finding it accessible and finding it extremely valuable in this particular time we're living through. So I'm just grateful that we'd kind of nailed the format and just pulled together this website with resources at the very moment when we needed to spring into action. I should also say that there are spaces on Ned's gathering at 9 o'clock tonight, and there are 3 gatherings tomorrow and 3 gatherings the day after. So do check the programme. You do need to email in advance if you want to be on any of those, because we need to send you the Zoom link and an order of service. I think that's all I need to say. I've no idea how long I was, Rory. Sorry if I was too long.
You were exactly 10 minutes, which is what I asked for. So you win on that, definitely. Thank you very much, Jane. I think I saw like a ripple of excitement run through everyone when you mentioned making amazing cakes. So I think that's definitely hit home with lots of people. Cake always helps. And also, I want to personally sort of recommend the Heart and Soul sessions that Jane runs. I went to my first one, I think, like last weekend virtually with Jane, and it was really, really, really good. And also, what I think is kind of awesome about what Jane has done with these Heart and Soul circles is to come up with something really good, which is loads and loads of work, and then just really, really generously share it with everybody else and share all the resources, all the ideas, do all the work for us, basically, so that all all we, people like me, have to do is pick that up, learn how to do it, and then go away and do it. And not everybody would be that generous with their creativity. So thank you for that on behalf of me and other people too, I'm sure. So I'm now going to hand over to Torry, who is in Norwich at the Octagon Chapel, who is going to talk to us now. Over to you, Torry.
Thank you very much, Rory, and thanks, Jane, for kicking us off. So Jane spoke about the need for heart and soul came from a personal need, and that's certainly something that I will be touching on what I'm speaking about. So I run something at the Octagon called Creedless. Creedless came about because I perceived there was a gap again in our services offering, and maybe some demographics weren't, and we probably still aren't reaching them, and there was certainly a need for something very different to what we did on a Sunday. And there was sort of a tingle in my mind because we just recently had an evangelical congregation move into a building further down, and whilst the theology certainly doesn't appeal, they're onto something with how they style their services and how they're marketed. And I come from a psychology and sort of theatre background, and I thought, oh, you know, I need to think about this sort of, interestingly, the psychological tricks about how I can use them in a positive way to kind of make people interested in what I want to offer them. So those are the two main thought streams that I went into the process with. So what I wanted to do was something much more contemporary than what we offer on a Sunday. The services at the Octagon on a Sunday are very, very varied because we don't have a minister, and they tend towards the humanist earth spirit end of the Unitarian spectrum often. It's very rare to hear a Bible reading or the Lord's Prayer in the chapel, but there are still very many traditional elements. You know, for hymns, it's often a hymn sandwich, and we use our organ for the majority of music in the hymn singing. And I really wanted to strip back some of those elements of what we do, and because often the messages are really interesting, but sort of reimagine some of those Unitarian sort of messages in a shifted context, so I could appeal to new groups, or just enhance and add another dimension to what we're doing for people who already attend. And the concept is that it gives a space and opportunity for a different worship time and style, which is really necessary in today's busy world, even again more now. So one of the first things I did, as I said, was I looked at how an evangelical church might name their youth and young adult offerings, because basically in my mind that was my target demographic. I had to go into it with sort of that marketing head of who am I trying to aim this at, regardless of the fact it's open to everybody. The reason I did that is because I'm just at the top end of that age group. So that was, I wanted to do something that appealed to me and my peers. So I quickly realised that a snappy one-word title was probably the way to go. So I played with a few and they felt a bit dry. And again, about that stripping back, I looked at what the essence of Unitarianism, and the thing that appeals to people often is that it's dogma free. And I thought, well, it's creedless. So there we go. That's how you get to creedless. So I made myself a logo. I haven't got it here because I can't screen share it with you, but I can share it and at a later date. And I can send you to our website as well, the Octagon website. So I stripped those back, and I wanted to look at being very contemporary and not using our organ. The dream, absolutely, because it's still something that's changing, would be live music, but at the moment that's not possible. So I use a playlist. I make myself a Spotify playlist for every creedless. And the other element I wanted to take away was the idea of having a hymn book. So we only ever do one piece of singing in the session, and I supply the words on a sheet. And often it's either something that's very a cappella and simple, like "Come, come, whoever you are," or we sometimes sing along with a recording. It's either a backing or it's a full song. We just sing along with whoever's singing. And the rest of the sheet, I make sort of them in A5 and put them on a clipboard so that people have got somewhere to write in case I want them to do any writing, because I kind of approach it holistically, that I want to, from that theatre senses, I want to speak to everybody's senses in the experience. So I'm looking at, you know, sound, sort of the thinking element, whether there's anything to physically do, like perhaps some writing and to get people to think of a question. So I want to kind of include all of those things. Just have to scroll down, sorry. And I also wanted to make the space that we've got feel intimate and informal. So unlike in a regular service, I'm not up at the front preaching from a lectern or a pulpit. I use a music stand or a table to keep my notes on, but I sit at the same level as everyone else. And I tend to only get up to light the chalice. So a lot of Creedless is about removing the barriers to engagement from attendees, and again removing the element that that it's a lecture. There's like an address. There is an address element, but it's not me standing up and pontificating everybody. It's really shifted how the service time feels. So once I was happy with sort of the elements, I started running it in June last year, and it usually runs monthly on the second Friday of each month in the evening. One of the most important aspects of Creedless, same as Jane, is that we are, in the real life version, is that refreshment time bookends the entire thing. So you get refreshments at the beginning and at the end. So we usually run from 7 when the doors open and the refreshments are already available. I try and make sure there's tea, coffee, decaf, caffeinated, apple juice, dairy free and none, so everybody's covered. You know, if there's something that you don't like eat, generally you're going to find something. I might need to start adding fruit, actually. I've had a fruit request. But so everybody can come and be nourished before I start, because often people are coming from work. Because we start at 7, it's an evening thing. I only finish work at 6. So I've usually had my dinner and then I just kind of want something for dessert. So the cake element is again really important. I'll often play some background music as people are coming in, but there's generally a bit of chat. I'm usually not involved in that. Generally, my partner Cheryl will kind of do the hospitality side, so that I've kind of got the time to get into the element of fact that I'm just about to run a service. So I make sure everybody's nourished before they start. We did start off in our chapel space, but as it got to the winter, we found that it was cold in there in the evening. And our heating is a lot to run, so we've moved over to the into our Martineau Hall, which is our hall, which we've recently had redone, and it works. I think it works better in there because actually it's not a church space. We're making the space sacred by what we're doing in it. I always, again, that thing where you've got the same things happening, so I always start with exactly the same words. I never vary the chalice lighting. We always have a story, regardless of, there's always a story element. So I start with a story, something that's spoken to me, and then we have joys and concerns. And obviously, because it's a Friday, again, people have got the cares of the week, perhaps something that's happened at work, they want to share those things. So I always leave space for that. And I mentioned that I do the music, and I always make sure that the music is very much part of it, because you're basically what you're doing with music is you're doing a listening element. So I will, if I've got a key word for the service, I do weird things. So I'll say if I'm doing a service on love, I'll actually just put love into Spotify, and then I'll listen through. Perhaps you get 4 tracks, generally speaking, in Creedless, but I might have listened to 30 or 40 things on Spotify to give you a really tailored, pared down, I call it carefully curated content, really pared down sense of what the essence of it is. So everything, there's a thread running through everything. When I did my very first one, it was about how love, there was a lovely thing about love is a doing word, and it was all about love and how it's an action. And that went through every single reading. So once I've got the music, I tend to do the music first, and then I go and find the readings, which seems like might seem to other people like a slightly backwards way of doing it, but it's just the way that works for me. And I think it's been really well received. I always have a responsive prayer as well, and that's again printed out onto A4 sheets, put onto the clipboards. It's A5 sheets and put onto the clipboard so that people can just leaf through to that. And again, I've started using the same responsive prayer because it creates that sense of familiarity. and that people are coming and they know the same things, because we're very habitual creatures, again, from the psychology side. We like the same things. Sometimes we like things to be the same, and then for that to vary, just to give us that little bit of mental workout, if you like. So that's about how that works. And I think I'm just going to leave it there, because I think people have probably now got questions about what it is. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Torry. That was great. And you kind of saw Jane's cake and raised it by offering 2 lots of refreshments. So sticking with the cake theme. And as you were talking, same as Jane, I'm furiously making notes here. So many kind of good ideas. And what I'm picking up from both of what you've just said is that a lot of it is about a real eye for detail, and those things which seem like small things being so important. And so that's really, yeah, that's what struck me. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alexis now. There we go. So over to you.
Hi there. I can see that when we get back out of the virtual space, I'm going to have to up my game and start offering more cake, because hard to do virtual cake over the internet. So I haven't been actively walking down this path as long as either Jane or Torry, but I have been very, very fascinated by ritual and how worship sort of functions as a human activity for quite some time. I was brought up Presbyterian in the US, and the structure of a Presbyterian church service is pretty similar to the Unitarian hymn sandwich. There's not really very much difference, except in the hymnal and the content of the sermon. But then we moved to London, and we moved to London when I was still in school, and this was before the internet, and which kind of dates me a bit. And there just aren't a lot of Church of Scotland churches in England, so we ended up going to the local Anglican church. And that was a really big change, because the Anglican church, of course, as we'll all know from history, still has its bishops, still celebrates the Eucharist every week, or most of the Anglican church does, and has a completely different service structure with a lot more ritual in it. And that ritual, it took me a long time to become engaged with it, but it really spoke to something in me that hadn't been satisfied in all the Presbyterian church services I went to when I was a young person. And after a while, I found myself in a very, very high church Anglican church. And to be perfectly honest with you, the first time I went there, I really, really enjoyed it. But I also was sort of clutching at my pearls thinking, oh my goodness, this is a terrible, terrible sin. All these graven images and things to smell and stained glass and pew cushions and all. What is this? But I was really fascinated by it. And my curiosity about it won out over my Calvinist indoctrination. And so for a very, very long time, I, was a weekly participant in High Mass. And some of you all will know from your own upbringings that going to a church centered around the Mass, you get lots and lots and lots of opportunities to participate in the ritual. The ritual really encompasses every person who turns up, whether they're sitting in the back pew and don't quite know what they're doing, or being an altar server, or a banner carrier, or a member of the choir, or so on and so forth. And so over the years, I took part as an altar server, both on weekdays and the weekends, and a choir member, and this and that and the other, and did the whole church year long ritual that comes into focus every Lent and Easter every year, and learned so much. Learned all the different sections of the liturgy, and really felt like Jane was talking about, that comfort and that safety that comes from repetition and predictability. And that really did sort of feed my soul, as it were, and really gave me a strong grounding in religion and liturgical practice that I would feel really lost without. However, in case you can't tell, I'm no longer going to the Anglican Church and have found Unitarianism. One of the disadvantages of a really highly liturgical and ritualistic church is that there is no room to innovate. There isn't a lot of breathing space. And of course, Unitarianism is completely the opposite of that. You can do what you will during the service without violating canon law and having a bishop come down and scold you. Individual congregations can make up their own minds about how things ought to work. And that's really a really great advantage. And I have been really lucky to be part of the ministry team at New Unity, which is a small group of volunteers who meets about once a month, and we study aspects of ministry and also work together to run the services when our minister is away or absent for whatever reason. So I've had the opportunity to both run services and give the message and so on and so forth over the past 18 months. A lot of what I have done with innovation in worship has actually been sneaking bits of things into the usual Sunday service. So the first time I did this was back in August. You'll remember from last year, Extinction Rebellion and environmental change was very much on everybody's minds, especially about exactly a year ago and all through the summer. And after Liz Slade very kindly organized a ritual tulip workshop in London last June, and I went to that. And that gave me some sort of framework, some basis for experimenting with ritual in worship. And so I devised a collective morning ritual for climate change. And that was, I think, the first time I had led a slightly unusual service. And so I introduced different elements into it about changing the space around so that our focus was in a slightly different place. I moved the chalice from the front into the center of the congregation so that we were all turned towards each other. I invited everybody to take part in an antiphonal reading. So some people would one side of the room read several lines of a poem, and then the other side of the room would respond, and we read some of the lines together, and invited people to share what it was they were worried about over climate change and to share their sorrowful feelings with each other so that we didn't have to feel so alone. And then after that, I have also helped Andy, our minister, devise an equinox ritual to sort of let go of the summer and bring in the change to winter. And in all of these sort of Sunday service reimaginings, I've really been focused on how do we change the space during the service so that we start one way, we move somewhere else in the middle, and we end in another place. Because that's sort of the goal that I'm after, is really changing people's state of being, their emotional state from the time that they enter the door until the time that they leave. We want to have some sort of experience of coming together, noticing the gap between where we are and where we wish we were, acknowledging that, and then moving a little bit closer to that, coming to a resolution, and then celebrating by having coffee and tea and biscuits in the common room afterwards. And that really is what I focus on, is space, is creating a change of state where we come in a little bit more separate and leave a little bit more together. And really focusing on engaging all the senses, because that is something I personally miss very much about going to High Church, Anglican Church, where you have incense, you have the smells, the bells, you have the incense, you have the wafer, the communion wine, all the gestures one does of standing and kneeling and walking around to receive the Eucharist in the middle. And I do miss that it isn't always the same to come and sit in a pew and stay there. And some other ways I have played with that are a service I did in September, where instead of leading the whole message myself, I sort of gave an introduction and invited everybody to break into smaller groups of people that they could talk to, and then nominate someone. So we sort of made a group message in the moment. Now, of course, this isn't a great time to be experimenting with changing people's space, or like minimum viable dancing, or handing around food or anything like that. And so for the past 3 weeks, I have been running virtual small groups, which we call circles groups, and that have been focused on a really swiftly devised coronavirus-focused curriculum of place, self, time, and practice. So the very first week we met, we talked about how we could find a space, whether it could be left there permanently or had to sort of be packed away and recreated every time, for reflection inside one's own house, so that you sort of have a mental escape from your new work from home or your childcare or what have you, someplace that you can retreat and be reflective. And then we talked about how our concept of self changes when we can't do what it is that we're doing. This week, we're talking about how the feeling of time has changed a great deal now that a lot of the markers are gone. And we'll be moving into developing a personal, spiritual, or reflective practice after that. So that has been very interesting. It is very different hosting things virtually, and I have learned so much about every video conferencing system that's available. We ended up using Google Hangouts because it's a little bit more low-key to set up than Zoom. And so far that has worked out, broadly speaking, okay. But it is very different. It's hard to know how to begin things well. It's hard to know how to end things well. And it's very difficult to know how to sort of pass the talking stick, as it were, when you can't always even see everybody's face. So yeah, so I've become really, really interested in finding out how do virtual gatherings work, what is good about them, because I was really surprised that they worked at all, to be perfectly honest. And of course, they aren't the same as meeting up in the same building on a Sunday, but I've been really interested in trying to figure out what does work and what doesn't work, and why.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Alexis, and thank you very much to all three of our speakers for sticking exactly to time. Amazing. Doesn't often happen, does it, on a panel? So that's really, really fantastic. It means that we've got over 20 minutes now to have some discussion in groups. I mean, there's so much stuff in this topic in general, but from those three speakers that we've just had, so many questions. I've written down a load of questions, and in the chat already I can see lots of questions appearing. So what I'm going to do is divide us into little groups via the magical power of Zoom, so that you can ask those questions and discuss them with each other. If you are fortunate enough to get Torry, Jane or Alexis in your group with you, you can ask them directly. And so I think we'll have like 5 or 6 minutes in those little groups, and then I'll bring us all back together, and then we'll see how we feel. We can either do that again, or we can have a bit of Q&A with the panel. But I've sensed there's lots of people that want to discuss and talk, so let's do that. So we now want to have, okay, so there's over 80 of us, so that's going to be quite a few groups. Let's go for like 4 or 5 people in a group, I think is good. And I'll give us 5 minutes. Okay, right. You're about to be dispersed into lots of groups. I'm going to give you a question which Jane actually came up with just before we started, in case you need any motivation to get thinking. And that question is, what needs are you not currently getting met in the worship that you attend, wherever that is and whatever that is? And what could you try that might meet those needs? And I think that question leads on really well from what we've just heard from our 3 speakers. So I'm going to send us off to our rooms now to talk about those things. Here we go. No, it's very handy, isn't it? Okay, so hopefully no one's feeling too dizzy after being spun around and thrown into those groups. So we've got we've got 13 minutes. So we can either do that again, or we can have some Q&A with everybody. So Oh, somebody's telling me I'm muted. Am I muted? Can you hear me? No, you can hear me. Right, okay, good. So if you want to go and do small groups again, if you could do this. Okay, so I don't see many hands moving. And if you want to do a Q&A with the panel where we all stay together, could you do that now? Okay, so there's a lot more for that. So obviously we're keen to hear from our panelists, which is great. What I now need to do is find them because it's rejiggled my screen so they're not at the top anymore. So there's Alexis. Okay, so I can unmute you. There is Torry and there is Jane. Okay, so they are all now free to speak. And what I'm going to ask you to do is pop your questions into the chat bar at the side, and I will read them out and then let our panelists answer them. So we had a few already. So I'm going to just scroll up and have a look. So one question that we had, which was an interesting one, was, well, an observation that all three of our speakers have been women, and whether there's something about a difference between men and women preferring small group worship to like big group worship, I guess, and if that's something that you thought about. So I'm going to put that one out there. And that's the only question I can see that's not about cake. So I'm gonna give that one to our panelists for now, as some others appear hopefully on the chat. So yeah, men and women in different styles of worship.
I haven't noticed that there is a particularly gender slant to either small groups or to regular Sunday services. I mean, women do slightly outnumber men, but I've never been to a church where that wasn't the case. So I don't think that there's anything particular to Unitarianism about that.
Yeah, as Alexis has mentioned, down with the binary. I don't actually. This is exposing because I don't actually identify as a woman. So just in case that confuses anybody, but I'm non-binary. So, but yeah, that it's. I think that I think different things work for different people, but I think that it's what I'm doing isn't necessarily a small group. It just happens to be a small group right now that I'm hoping to grow, and it's about the same size as a small congregation. I tend to get between sort of 6 and 8 people, so it seems like a small group, but it doesn't need to function as one. I could easily do it with 200 people and it would work exactly the same way, but for me anyway, that's how that works.
Okay.
Yeah, with Heart and Soul, I would say it's fairly evenly matched, but at summer school I've noticed it's nearly always more women than men. I don't have an interpretation for that especially, but it's an observation.
Great. Okay, well, thank you all for your responses, and apologies for misgendering and mistakes there. We've got a flood of questions coming in, so I'm going to maybe pick 3 and read them all at once, and then I'll leave it up to the 3 of you which ones you want to pick out and answer. So one here which I think is Bob Janice Dillon. I think it is. So it says, in our small group we talked about 3 small group S's: structure, spontaneity and silence. How important would you say those are? Then another question here from Simon Hall. Do you find that there is enough support for additional gatherings that complement the main weekly service, or is there enough in just looking to innovate for that existing service? And then okay, a similar question, which is from Bridport and Bristol, Lizzie and John, I think. Have you found that your alternative midweek approaches to worship have had a creative, inspiring effect on how your Sunday services work? i.e. is there cross-fertilization between the two? So there's 3 questions to throw at the 3 of you there, and I'll leave it up to you which ones you want to go with.
I've got a quick response to that last one. There's definitely cross-fertilisation, and that's enhanced by the fact that at Kensington we have thematic ministry. So often, what with Heart and Soul being on the first Thursday of the month, often that's the first outing of the theme, and often whoever's leading worship that month will be present, and the conversation and the sharing that comes in that first Heart and Soul will possibly shape our thinking in the weeks ahead. Also, a thing I probably didn't say in when I was talking was that we've really used Heart and Soul as a way to build confidence in worship leaders. So sometimes people who wouldn't dare take on a Sunday service or even a part of a Sunday service have done readings for the first time in Heart and Soul, or have made little contributions which then the worship leader has run with, and that's been a useful confidence building for them.
Just to pick that one up, there isn't really a cross-fertilisation at the moment, because in the small group somebody asked me if I had different people attending Creedless, and at the moment I don't. It tends to be people who already come to the chapel, and as I said, the content of the services that is run at the Octagon tends to be really varied and interesting anyway. It just happens that people tend towards a hymn sandwich, but we already have people playing contemporary music. We sometimes have people playing something. Do we have people playing live music other than the organ? It's just that the structure tends to be the same, and I just wanted to create something very different. So there isn't necessarily that cross-fertilisation, but it might happen later. I mean, I've only been running this for about 8 months, so it's not. It might happen as time goes on. So I don't know yet.
Yeah, and being on week 3 of the circles groups at New Unity, there hasn't been a lot of cross-fertilization at all. But I know the idea behind having circles groups in the first place was not so much to affect Sunday worship as to give people within the congregation a chance to get closer to each other, to build more strong relationships within the congregation, because that has an effect on how everything works for everybody in the long run. It has been interesting to me that the people who have signed up for circles groups tend either to be those people who are there every Sunday and say hello to every newcomer that they see in coffee hour, and then everybody else is either someone who has recently returned to us after a long time away or a newcomer. So I think people are turning up to that because they do want to get to know people a little bit more. Whether they're motivated by hospitality or whether they're motivated by being new or returning.
Okay, well, thank you all. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and pick out a couple of more questions.
Can I just jump in on that 3S's one, because I don't want to lose that observation? Is that all right? I love that formulation of the silence, the spontaneity, and the structure. That feels like a perfect distillation of what I'm trying to do. And what occurred to me on reading that was every person trying to lead worship, every person in the worship will have a different preferred balance between those 3 things. And I know that I'm a bit spontaneity averse, but having the structure and the silence and the permission not to speak makes me feel safe with the spontaneity. So I just wanted to sort of observe there's some sort of nice dynamic between those 3.
Yeah, I think that those 3 small group S's certainly do apply to Creedless. There's always the structure, there's always the spontaneity, because joys and concerns happens every time regardless. And I always build in a bit of time for people to just, there's always a silence kind of after perhaps one of the pieces of music, people to really consider what they've just been listening to. So they're just as important, I think, in a larger context than as in a small group. I think they're really important. So,
and I'm going to want to keep adding extra S's, because just as we sit in here, I'm thinking of space, as in the physical space, and safety, which is underpins all the others.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really interesting question that Matthew Smith asked. I've just spotted. Can I answer that one?
Of course you can.
Matthew says, is there a sense in which interactive worship is in itself potentially exclusive because it privileges the articulate. And I don't think for creed, in terms of creedless, that applies, because the only interactive thing in that sense is perhaps like responsive reading. Well, if you don't do responsive readings, then you don't have to participate. And also the what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, the joys and concerns. But if there was one of the things that I haven't introduced, which I want to introduce, is a bit of mindfulness colouring. So if people just want to sit, I don't mind. As you've probably noticed, my hands are constantly moving whilst I'm speaking to you. Probably quite distracting. I'm constantly playing with a pen. So if I'm sitting through a service, I'd want to do some mindfulness colouring, which is why I thought about having the clipboards and then give people pens and pencils, and they can do some colouring on the theme, and then that's their interactive element. They don't need to do anything more than that. If they don't want to do anything, they can just sit and listen. So it's certainly one of those spaces where I don't want to make people feel like they have to speak. And sometimes, even if we're in a small group, sometimes I'll just check in, kind of look around, and if people don't want to speak for joys and concerns, then they just kind of give me a little shake and I'll just pass over and carry on. So
I know for me, concerns about sort of balancing who can participate and how well and fully they can participate is part of the motivation behind exploring how participation can come from tasting things, smelling things, from moving rather than from speaking, and so on and so forth, because I do sometimes wonder, especially with Unitarian services, what would you be able to do if you were deaf or very hard of hearing? How would you really be able to participate? And so I think when we start introducing elements that play with more of the senses, we create more availability for people to participate as an integral part of the service. So, because interactive doesn't just have to mean speaking back and forth. It can mean all sorts of things.
It can mean eating cake.
It can mean eating cake, yes, and probably should.
Fruit. And somebody said paleo options, which I'm definitely going to consider.
I think it's wonderful that as we hit exactly an hour, we have come back to cake again. I think it's that time of day when we might be a bit hungry. I'm just gonna guess that. So we have timed it perfectly. I would like to thank our three speakers who've been wonderful. I'm sure we're all going to go away with lots of ideas. I know, unfortunately, we're all muted, but silent clapping we can do. That's good. I can make a noise. There we go. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to carrying on these discussions as we go over the next 3 days. So hopefully see lots of you later. I think 8 o'clock is the social gathering, the fun stuff tonight. So hopefully see lots of you there. Hope you're all enjoying, and thanks again to our speakers. Bye-bye.